So some ancient Greek political ideas were incarnated in goddesses, such as Themis, the goddess of divine justice, and her daughter Dike, the goddess of human justice, here also known as Astraea. And anyone who happened to see my last Gresham lecture might remember these two images. Dike also had two sisters, Irene, peace, and Eunomia, the goddess of good legal order. And you can see the three sisters here in their guise also incarnating the seasons. And here they're following the god Dionysus. But the main subject of my lecture tonight was never turned by the Greeks into a goddess at all. So I don't have any beautiful image to show you. It is equality under law, equal legal order, isonomia, which the Greeks considered entirely human. So I'm going to begin with this contrast between these two ideas, eunomia, the archaic idea of good order or good legal order, who was a goddess, and isonomia, equal legal order, who or which was not. So isonomia, as we'll see, can also be described as equality of law, equality under law, equality through law. And I want to emphasize that it was seen by the Greeks from its inception as the product of human effort, and especially of democratizing human effort. So we see this connection between democracy and isonomia in the historian Herodotus. And Herodotus gives us this famous debate. It's a constitutional debate about the relative merits and disadvantages of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But he doesn't call it democracy. He calls it isonomia. So he actually puts this debate in the mouth of a 6th century Persian aristocrat, actually a group of these 6th century Persian aristocrats. And the one who speaks in favor of the rule of the majority calls it isonomia in this dialect form, a slightly different spelling. So this is an interesting thought. Isonomia, equality of law, is actually a way of thinking about democracy. It's a product of democracy, and it incarnates democratic values. And so what I want to do is to explore how and why that is. Now, Herodotus was actually writing about 2 generations after a major breakthrough in the slow process of democratization in Athens. So we can fix our ideas about the emergence of Greek democracy here in the very late 6th century BCE, 508, when a democratic revolution in Athens overthrew a family of tyrants. And they brought to power this man Cleisthenes, who then built up a new popular democratic identity. Now, that's all the detail I'm going to give you about the history of democratization in Greece tonight. That's going to be the topic of my next lecture. But for tonight, what I want to explore is how this democratic change brings with it this new idea, this human idea of equality of law. So all you need to do is think about this cusp. If you think about the year 500 or so, that's the turning point from the 6th to the 5th century BCE. And that's this major step towards the realization of democracy in Athens. And from there, it spreads to elsewhere in Greece. Now, when I stress that isonomia grew up out of and is so closely connected to democracy, that doesn't mean that it was confined to the political sphere alone. So we also find it beyond politics. So at about the same time, at about 500 BCE, we have a medical doctor, like our provost of Gresham College, a medical doctor, who describes health as an isonomia, an equal balance of powers within the body. So he's bringing, arguably, democratic political ideas to a metaphor for physical health. And it's also been argued that a bit earlier, this is a kind of prehistory of isonomia, that the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander modeled his ideas of the cosmos, of the universe, on Greek political circles. So going back to Homer, we have models of Greek politics in which there's a speaker in the middle of a circle who is equidistant from everyone. So we see a kind of equality there that gives rise ultimately to equal law. Now, Anaximander doesn't use the word isonomia, but the scholar Jean-Pierre Vernant and others have argued that the idea is already kind of taking shape in his cosmological thought. So we see isonomia now emerging and becoming a kind of way of organizing one's thinking about the nature of order in the body, in the universe, all of that connected also to politics. So here's my plan for the lecture. My next step is going to be to develop further this contrast between aristocratic eunomia and democratic isonomia. And after that, I'm going to take a step back to explore rival ways in Greek philosophy of understanding the meaning of equality itself. What is equality? And then I'll bring those rival understandings of equality to bear on understanding isonomia, and we'll look at 3 dimensions: equality under law, equality through law, and the effort of equalization as a political challenge. So 3 parts, and then the third part will itself have those 3 parts. So a little bit more then to begin with eunomia as an ancient aristocratic value. So the word comes from the roots for good or well, that's the eu or eu word, and law or lawfulness, the word nomos. And so that's how it comes to mean good legal order. And some of our richest evidence for this as an archaic ideal comes from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, whom I've also spoken about previously here at Gresham. And you see this, for example, in this poem, which is ascribed to Solon. And Solon writes, "Good legal order, eunomia, reveals all that is orderly and fitting, and often places fetters round the unjust." And then notice the feminine pronoun. She makes the rough smooth. This is the goddess eunomia, so personified. And at the end of the quotation, she puts an end to the anger of grievous strife. So you can see that this is a kind of ideal of good order, of obedience, and of a kind of justice, but there's nothing here about the equalization of political power. That's what's missing. So this is the sense in which this is a kind of aristocratic ideal. Everyone stay in their place. My station and its duties. Everyone should maintain order as it's been inherited. That's, in a way, probably the idea of eunomia that Solon himself inherited. So this idea never becomes a slogan for democracy. We have to turn to isonomia for that. Now, to be sure, there is a kind of formal equality that the Greeks must have cared about, even in this idea of eunomia, because that's part of any idea of law. After all, law is about treating equal cases equally. So what isonomia is doing is that it's going to build in something stronger. We can say it's not just going to be formal equality, it's going to be a substantive move in which seeming social and political unequals are treated radically as equals. So the scholar John Lombardini has emphasized this contrast, and again, just to drive that home, right, isonomia is equal order versus a kind of more generalized idea of good order. And what I want to emphasize there is that the crucial claim here, what was radical in this democratizing, humanizing move, is that equality can generate order too. And that's a claim that elites then, as now, have tended to question and reject. So that's the radical democratic move. If what we want is order, equality also can bring it about. Now, as you see in the second quotation on the slide, Lombardini emphasizes that isonomia involves an equal distribution in regard to law. So it's different from that traditional elite vision. And when he speaks of an equal distribution, this actually picks up on a different etymology that some scholars have seen in the word isonomia. So I follow those who connect it to nomos, law. But it has been suggested that it might also be connected to this verb nemein, which means to distribute. And what's interesting about that is that even though I think the nomos root makes better sense of these parallel words, as another scholar has pointed out, so we know that in eunomia, it's a nomos root for law. In anomia, it's a nomos root for law. In autonomia, it's a nomos root for law. So it makes sense that in isonomia, it's a nomos root as well. But nevertheless, I think the idea of distribution is also at work, because achieving a genuinely equal distribution of political power in relation to law is what isonomia would come to mean. Okay, so to sum up this first part of the lecture, as I began by saying, in contrast to those goddesses of divine and human justice, those beautiful incarnations, and of good legal order, there's no goddess for isonomia, no divine genealogy, no imagery. It's a thoroughly human affair. And it was much later as a word and an idea than other roots that the Greeks had, other words that the Greeks had with the iso root. So iso has an older history, but isonomia seems to be something new under the classical Greek sun from around 500 BCE. And it's defiantly human rather than divine. But what exactly did it mean? So this brings me to the second part of the lecture, where I want to explore two rival Greek understandings of the meanings of equality itself. So I'm going to start with something that I invoked in the announcement for this lecture, which is the remark by the Nobel Laureate, economist, and philosopher Amartya Sen, who pointed out that whenever we talk about equality, we must always ask, as he put it, equality of what? So if you think about it, that's actually intuitive. If we say that Karim and Layla are two equally good tennis players, we're summing up across all the domains of their tennis skills in making an overall judgment. But it wouldn't necessarily follow that they're equally good at serving or volleying. They might have different skills that even out across their performance on the whole court. So if we say they're equally good tennis players, we have to always answer equality of what? What are we talking about in saying that they're equal? And actually, whenever we judge two things to be equal, we always have to abstract away from dimensions in which they are unequal. Otherwise, they would be identical, not simply equal. So to bring this home, let me call up a modern remark by the novelist Anatole France, who remarks that two people in liberal democracies are held to be equal before the law. And he said, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. So what this is saying is that the law, in this case, announces these facially equal prohibitions. They're formally equal. But we can predict already that they're likely to be violated out of necessity only by the poor. So here the rich and the poor are equal with respect to this law in one way, but they're clearly unequal in another way. The law hits the poor much harder. So conversely, if a law announces an equality of opportunity, we also know that it won't necessarily result in equality of outcome. So we always have to decide equality of what? What is the equality that we care about? Is it the starting line? Is it the condition in which people come to the starting line? Is it the conditions in which they find themselves afterwards? And the political theorist Humaira Iqtidar has drawn on the Muslim thinker Maududi to expand on Sen's point, arguing that different domains of equality have to be defended in different terms. Okay, so that's the general logic of political equality. It's always equality of what? But how did they think about that question in ancient Greece? So if we transpose that question back to ancient Greece, of course, we have to acknowledge that we find, first of all, a total negation of equality in the widespread phenomenon of slavery. The pervasive exclusion of the enslaved was a way of setting their political worth at zero, so they couldn't figure in any calculation of equality at all. But beyond that, Greek philosophers identified a contrast between two kinds of equality, and I want to develop this contrast. So one is equality via weighing. We can call this geometric equality. And the other is equality via counting, and we call this arithmetic equality. So let me illustrate this with this example. So consider on the left, imagine that this is a bag of a few heavy and valuable gold pieces versus a bag of a lot of small, light sticks. So in this example, the gold physically weighs more, and so it's monetarily worth more. So if we talk about geometric equality, the gold is unequal to the sticks because it weighs more heavily. It's worth more in these terms. But if we think about arithmetic equality, we just count pieces individually, and there are more sticks, ex hypothesi, than there are pieces of gold. And so in arithmetic equality terms, the sticks are more than the gold because there are more of them. Now, the philosopher Aristotle, and this is a picture of him in a statue put up in his birthplace of Stagira, developed this contrast, and he defined these two kinds of equality as follows. So geometric equality, he said, is the equality of ratios. That's where we weigh and we assert a different worth. Versus arithmetic equality, which is sameness in number or size, and we figure that out by counting. And this contrast had real political implications. So think of what might seem like the simplest, most straightforward political task, counting votes. We might think it's obvious how you count votes. You just count them each for one. Surely that's an example of arithmetic equality. But the scholar Melissa Schwartzberg has pointed out that it was only at a specific historical moment that the ancient Athenians started to practice individual vote counting in key political institutions. Before that, and outside Athens, votes were often taken by cheering. So the side that cheered loudest was taken to win. And we refer to this as voting by acclamation. So this happened in some elections, for example, in ancient Sparta. This is the marketplace, the agora of ancient Sparta, for the election of certain office holders. So imagine that a committee is sequestered inside that building that you can see at the back of the slide, and the crowd is cheering outside, and the committee inside has to try to gauge how much support is there for each of the candidates, and that's how these office holders were elected. Now, there's something interesting, I think, to be said for that, because sometimes what one wants to know is not just how many people are for something, but how strongly they are for it. But it also shows us that even something that seems so straightforward as voting is actually subject to this question, equality of what? We have to decide, are we aiming in voting to weigh collective enthusiasm, like the bag of gold, or to count noses, to count discrete individual votes, like the individual sticks? Now, Aristotle again pointed out that this difference between weighing and counting amounted to two different ideologies of political equality in the time that he was writing. So he identified a contrast between the way that oligarchs and democrats thought about equality. So for the oligarchs, as he wrote, if they are unequal in one respect, for example, wealth, they consider themselves to be unequal in all. So for the oligarchs, wealth is a measure of worth and value, and it's geometric because it extends into another dimension. There may be a certain, everyone has noses, but oligarchs in addition have this extra wealth that gives them extra worth. And in Sparta again, so still with this image, which was essentially an oligarchy, political freedom and full citizenship was restricted to a very small number of men who called themselves the peers or the similars, the homoioi. And they were similar in being judged equally worthy. So that there wasn't an abstract ideal of equality. It was their special worth that made them weigh as citizens. So Democrats, by contrast, wanted to claim that every free male citizen was equal, and they counted noses arithmetically. And these opposed views of equality were the source of political tension and unrest. And again, Aristotle describes this in the Politics in Book 5 when he speaks of the causes of revolution. So he says the Democrats think that as they are equal, they ought to be equal in all things. While the oligarchs, under the idea that they are unequal, they're worth more because of their property, claim too much. And both parties, whenever their share in the government does not accord with their preconceived ideas, stir up revolution. So as this suggests, this distinction between geometric and arithmetic equality picks up on real fault lines, real historical political struggles. And we can see it at work in much more recent history as well. So consider, for example, the partial moves in Britain in 1918 toward enfranchising women and young men serving in the armed forces. And of course, 1918 is a moment of the Great War, the First World War, the very moment in which suffragettes were agitating for the vote and soldiers were fighting in the trenches. Now, if we look at the text of the 1918 representation of the People Act, we see geometric equality at work. So women over the age of 30 who met a property qualification were enfranchised by this act to vote. So notice that distinction. Even in this move towards enfranchising women, there's still a view that some women are worth more than others, a view that an ancient Greek oligarch would have recognized. Wealth and property still made a difference to your worth as a citizen. And interestingly, also for young men, men in the armed forces who were serving in the armed forces as the war was continuing were allowed to vote from the age of 19. They had extra political worth compared to most men who were enfranchised only at the age of 21. And so even in this key moment in moving towards an equalization of the franchise, we see elements of an oligarchical view, a geometric equality view of weighing political worth, not just counting noses. So democratizing the franchise in ancient Greece, in modern Britain, and elsewhere required effortful moves to count rather than to weigh. And as I now turn to the final part of the lecture, where I'm going to bring these rival views of equality to bear on isonomia as equal law, what I'll be arguing is that even in supposedly arithmetically equal democratic contexts, aspects of geometric inequality can still be hidden. So now I come to the third and final part of the lecture, which is the meanings of isonomia. So coming back to that democratic human idea of equality of law. And I'm going to look at 3 different ways that we can understand that. Because as you will have noticed, I gave this lecture the title Ancient Greek Ideas of Equality Under the Law. But actually remember, when we saw the different etymology of the word isonomia, there's no preposition in it. It's just equal law, or equal legal order, or equal distribution, if you go with that etymology. There's no under. But in English, we tend to add prepositions. So I added equality under the law. But of course, that's just one possible interpretation. And so now what I want to do in this final part of the lecture, I'm going to begin with equality under the law, contrast that with equality through law, and then conclude with the political effort of equalization, of making someone count as an equal. So equality under the law, and here I'm going to emphasize the content of the laws. So how might laws fail to be equal in this sense of treating people equally under the law? So just to remind you again of this Anatole France quotation, right, this is one way. We know in advance that laws against vagrancy are going to hit harder against the poor than the rich. And this sort of problem was already recognized by the post-classical author Plutarch, who took the Athenian lawgiver Solon to have tried to ward it off by abolishing the debts of the poor to secure their equal standing. And I talked about this in my previous lecture, but here I want to call your attention to the words in green in the middle of the slide, right? What Plutarch argues here about Solon's abolition of debts is that equality under the laws is of no avail if the poor are robbed of it by their debts. So it's exactly the Anatole France point made in the 1st to 2nd century CE. And it's interesting there, nomon isoteta, you can see is related to isonomia, right? This is a noun for equality. So this is literally equality of laws, but the standard translation translates it as equality under the laws. And so we see here how laws that are formally equal may not always treat people substantively equally. So even more egregious are laws that are formally equal but intend to discriminate. So you might argue that a case like this or the vagrancy laws, they don't intend to discriminate. It's just that the way society is set up, one knows that there will be a disparate impact. But Plato has one of his characters in the Republic actually argue that each kind of constitution intends to discriminate for some people and against others. So this is Plato's character Thrasymachus, who's based on a real ambassador from another Greek city to Athens. And he's cynically describing the way that he sees laws functioning in various political regimes. And he says, democracy makes democratic laws. Tyranny makes tyrannical laws. Whoever's in charge in each constitution is making laws to their own advantage. So this is an even more pointed unveiling of law as formally equal, but substantively unequal. People in this case aren't actually equal under the laws, even though the laws might pretend that they are. So these examples highlight how isonomia can be undermined by forms of hidden privilege in which elitist geometric equality is still concealed, or geometric inequality, we might say. Just because laws look facially equal doesn't mean that they actually do affect people equally or are intended to do so. So one can think of a recent scandal in the UK over the fast track that was set up to authorize government purchases of personal protective equipment at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? This was a scheme that might have been formally equal, but only the elite and well-connected were likely to succeed with the way that the scheme was actually set up. So when we think of isonomia as equality under the law, we see that it requires constant interrogation and critique to ensure that laws that are genuinely democratically equal. And we have to constantly expose and root out pretenses to even-handedness that may conceal hidden privilege. So the next interpretation of isonomia that I want to consider is equality through law. So we were just talking about equality under law. Now I want to talk about equality through law. And here we can think of law as granting rights and procedures that one can exercise to vindicate one's equal political standing. So think, for example, of the equal right to a jury trial of one's peers. Now, of course, that right doesn't necessarily ensure an equal ability to make use of it. If you can't afford to hire a lawyer, or if you lack the money and leisure to be able to bring a case. So this is why one of the important features of Athenian isonomia was actually the existence of open public prosecutions. So if this were an ancient Greek jury, the person bringing the case wouldn't be a paid official appointed by the state. It could be anyone who could bring a case on behalf of someone else if it was a matter that affected the citizens as a whole. So the citizen prosecutor was as important as the citizen jury and the citizen assembly to the realization of isonomia as equality through law in ancient Athens. Now, this is another way in which hidden privileging or disprivileging can hide beneath formally open laws. So the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales has stated that backlogs in the UK criminal justice system are now resulting, and I quote from an article in The Guardian, in victims of crime dying waiting for justice as they face delays of up to 6 years for their cases to be dealt with in court. So we can see from the Athenian example of public prosecutors that legal aid and investment in public prosecution to avoid undue trial delays has a Greek pedigree as being at the heart of a conception of equality through law. Justice delayed is too often justice denied. And we see a different kind of threat to isonomia as equality through law today in regimes of authoritarian populism, sometimes called elected autocracies. So there we see equality through law being undermined. My colleague at Princeton, Kim Shepley, calls this autocratic legalism. It's a phenomenon of hollowing out rights and procedures so that they continue to be observed in form, but they lose their protective power and their moral point. So a legally equal right to a fair trial means little if you can't afford a lawyer, but it also means little if judges have been cowed or captured, fired, appointed, or intimidated by a political movement that rejects judicial independence. And this is something that we're seeing in many countries around the world. Shepley's pointed out that the EU is now working to embed rights into structures to try to make equal law part of a more robust infrastructure so that it can be genuinely realized and protected. So again, from the ancient Greek point of view, the thought here is that isonomia is never just a given with formal rule of law. We have to always return to that democratizing force, that push of the iso root, equality through law, and that has to be constantly defended and enforced against powerful institutional and ideological forces that have always been arrayed to resist it. And this leads me to my final point. And here I want to talk about not the adjective equal and not the noun equality, but the verb equalization. So ancient Greek has a verb that means to equalize, isasthesomai, and this means to make equal, to balance. It can be used of a person holding scales. But this verb, like many Greek verbs, could be used in the grammatical middle voice. And the middle voice is a verb conjugation that implies often a self-affecting, a reflexive dimension of the action that the verb describes. So in the middle voice, this verb means to make oneself equal to another, This is an effort that a person can carry out themselves to equalize their standing. And this usage goes back as far as Homer in the Iliad, book 24, where Homer describes how a human being, Niobe, had dared to compare herself, to make herself equal to the goddess Leto, and she was punished by Leto's daughter, Artemis, for this audacity. In fact, Niobe had bragged that she had more children than the goddess, and so the gods and goddesses killed all of Niobe's human children. Now, in that case, making oneself equal is an act of hubris, but I want to rescue the idea of making oneself equal and connect it back to the winning of the vote by women, by working class men, and originally by the poorest male citizens in ancient Greece, all of which was integral to the consolidation of democracy. All of these changes, these claims to arithmetic equality, were not just mathematically or politically obvious. They were enacted through acts of equalization that were really acts of self-equalization. So I started by mentioning that democratic revolution in 508 BCE, right? That was an act of self-equalization. And in later centuries, enslaved peoples have made written and spoken appeals that enacted their claim to equality, efforts of self-equalization. And for example, we see this in the great 19th century orator and political thinker Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery in the United States. And he rejected the demand that he should have to prove his claim to freedom and equality. So in a famous speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," Douglass made his point not by offering an argument, but by self-equalizing with the claim, as he put it, "There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him." So Douglass is comparing himself to everyone else who would know that slavery is wrong for them and saying, so too is it for me and for my fellow African Americans. And most significantly, in my eyes, Douglass began this speech, which he delivered in 1852, with the words, "fellow citizens." Now, this was a time when even free black men in the United States could generally not vote. There were a few cases where they were temporarily enfranchised in some cities or states, but generally they couldn't vote. So this is a moment when Douglass is not technically a fully equal citizen. He's not entitled to the right to vote at that moment, but he self-equalizes by calling other Americans his fellow citizens. And in this way, he made a claim of self-equalization, as many others have done, to write themselves into politics. And I want to offer one last example of this act of self-equalization. And this is about voter registration drives in the contemporary United States. So the legal scholar Catherine Abrams has described state voter registration drives that have been conducted by young people who are themselves undocumented immigrants to the United States. So they are not legally entitled to vote, but they have volunteered enthusiastically to register others. And Abrams calls this an act of contentious citizenship. So these young people are unable to vote themselves, but they self-equalize. They make themselves into participants in a political and civics framework that does not yet count them as full legal equals. Now, that might seem a surprising story to have arrived at, starting from ancient Greek ideas. But what I've tried to indicate is that it should not be so surprising, because the idea of isonomia, equal law, equality under the law, equality through the law, was itself a radical idea in ancient Greece. It had to be vindicated through struggle, self-assertion, self-equalization to try to construct more fair, though still flawed, political institutions. So these acts of self-equalization then, as now, go to show that even arithmetic equality is far from being a given. It's not obvious that this is the answer to the question, equality of what? It's a political demand and part of a political struggle. Outside mathematics, and certainly in the domain of ethics and politics, claims of equality are always acts of equalization. And at a time when democratic equal legal order, or isonomia, is under threat in many different places and ways, these kinds of acts of equalization and self-equalization continue to offer paths to its fuller realization. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for another brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know, Melissa came over on the red eye last night from the States, so to be able to perform like that after no sleep and is brilliant, wonderful. Thank you.
My previous flight was canceled. I didn't intend to arrive this morning, but so it transpired.
I'll take a question from online first, but it's quite an interesting one given what you were talking about, self-equalization and the power of it. Is it unrealistic to expect laws to be equal or applied equally for the poor when the lawmakers are themselves not poor and therefore have, if you like, a cultural disconnect from the people for whom they're legislating?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question, and it really picks up on some of the ancient Greek thoughts that I highlighted in the lecture. So I think that thought was very thinkable to the Greeks. That was the thought that Plato's character Thrasymachus is putting forward when he says the people in power make laws to their own advantage. So I think sometimes we tend to idealize the ancient Greeks and think, oh, they were so high-minded, they didn't entertain these cynical and skeptical challenges, but actually it's the opposite. They posed these really deep challenges. And I think my answer to that would be, it's an effort. It's a struggle. One can't simply assume that laws that are passed in any given political system are going to be fair. And of course, that also is something, as I'll argue in my lecture next time, that's also something that the critics of democracy saw from the other side. They said, well, if the poor are in power, they're going to make laws in their own favor. So there's a real question and a kind of challenge about what does it make to try to make laws that are genuinely equal. And, I think it's sort of a struggle where people are always, in a way, overshooting, falling short, and one has to kind of, simply work with every particular law in order to try to redress that balance.
You talk a lot about lawmakers in this talk. How does that relate, say, in the modern world, or even ancient Greek world, to the concept of an independent judiciary separate from the lawmakers?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So part of ancient Greek democracy in Athens is that the demos, which means, this is an anticipation of my next lecture, all the people, but it also has a special emphasis of the common people who were the majority, who were relatively poor compared to a much smaller elite of about 10 to 15%. So the people staffed the judiciary, and they also kind of staffed the assembly. So there's a sense in which they are judging the very laws that kind of maybe were in part formulated or in part inherited in their political order. So, I think today with the professionalization of the profession of law, the profession of the judiciary, then we have a different kind of set of problems. So for the Athenians, that was one set of problems where they thought, well, this is actually all people from a certain social class dominating all these roles. Now we almost have the opposite. We have, these roles are professionalized in ways that mean that people from lower social classes are more rarely represented in them. And so again, I would say there's a tension that what I've tried to argue is that equality of law it sounds like we could just get it right once and for all and there's a simple answer. And actually, that just isn't true. There's always a question, equality of what, equality for whom, equality how, and law is part of that story. It's not a kind of separate domain that could give us a neutral set of conclusions.
Let's take some questions from the floor, if anyone has one. So come up here, you first and you second, then just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Really interesting. There's lots of high-minded people who undertake voluntary activities to try and help redress legal imbalances. And you gave the example of the voter registration folks in the States. And here you might think of volunteers at citizens' advice bureaus or even lawyers who do pro bono work. I mean, in ancient Greece, were there similar people who were actively trying to do things to address some of the imbalances that were being discussed by the philosophers and the thinkers?
Yeah, so I mentioned this figure of the kind of citizen prosecutor, where anyone in Athens, just to take Athens as the example, could, if it was a case that was thought to affect the society broadly, anyone could bring a case. So somebody might not be able to bring a case themselves, but somebody else could bring it for them. Now, it has to be said, motives are often mixed, they're not always pure. And so some of the time, those people were doing it to make a name for themselves, in part, in some way. And I think we also do have to be conscious of the dangers of a kind of vigilantism if people start to bring cases when they think that they see a cause, but other authorities may not. So I'm kind of giving it as an example, but again, I don't think there's any one perfect answer to these problems. I think every effort that we make to try to achieve this has advantages, it has strengths. The existence of people like that can be a very great boon. We also have to be aware that there can be unintended consequences. Any institution can be misused. So I think it's a balance in that way. But I think that this, I exactly wanted to bring out that this role of citizens acting on behalf of others is an important role that can, in some circumstances, really help to vindicate the equality through law for people who can't do it for themselves.
Next question, I think.
Thank you very much for that. It was very fascinating. I just had a question regarding, I think it was arithmetic is the term. Was there any critique during the ancient Greeks of how it might affect equality for minorities, as in the majority would choose a law in regards?
Yes, thank you very much. No, that's a great question, the question of majority-minority relationships. And I know it seems like I'm harping on about the rich-poor divide in ancient Greece in all of my lectures, but it's because it was so front and center in Greek politics. I mean, again, if you go back to that constitutional debate that I presented, and I'll talk about it more next time, exactly the choice of politics is essentially, should we have an oligarchy or should we have a democracy? That was kind of the live choice. So, and we'll see next time again, there's actually this amazing text that is anonymous text, but it seems to have been written by an anonymous kind of wealthy Athenian observing how the democracy was working, but being very critical of it, exactly because he thought that it was being unfair to the minorities. So there's definitely a kind of observation that any majority can be unfair to minorities, and I think that is an important point. Democracy as majority rule incarnates certain values, but it also incarnates certain risks. And so again, we're looking to balance the values that we're standing for and test different institutional arrangements rather than saying any one is the perfect solution. So come or tune in next time and I will talk more about this. Actually, next week. It's next Thursday, in fact.
To extend that question, do you think that equality under the law depends on having equality of morals within and between societies?
This is a very interesting question. I think certainly legal equality incarnates values that, again, we have to care about them if we're going to really keep it meaningful. So that was the example that I meant with the autocratic legalism. legal order can just be hollowed out. It can be abused. It can be manipulated, right? And we're seeing this again in these elected autocracies where formally they have democracy, they have equality of law, but the judges have been suborned. And so, really one can't expect a fair trial, even though notionally the motions will be gone through. And so this is where I wanted to really emphasize it really is about values. It's about what we think equality of law should stand for. And then we always have to interrogate, is whatever way we think we're doing it, does it have flaws? Can we improve it? And again, however we try to improve it, we'll probably err to the other side and we'll have to improve it further. So it's a kind of never-ending struggle. But the effort to articulate the values and really stand up for them, I think, is what's critical.
Sir, in the front here.
Today we think of equality to some extent being underpinned by checks and balances.
Yeah.
So bicameral, two houses.
Yeah.
So in Hungary, Orban doesn't have a second house. He can sort of do what he wants. In the Czech Republic, there's two houses, and the second house says no and is voted in slightly differently. So you get that. It's an anti-majoritarian kind of thing.
Yeah.
How did that stand in ancient Greece? What did they think about that? Or do that?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So again, if we just take the example of Athens, there is a council, well, there are two councils, but I'll focus on one of them in particular, as well as an assembly. So it formally looks like a kind of second house, but its role was actually not the role of revising or approving, the way, for example, the House of Lords functions. Rather, its role was primarily to prepare the agenda for the assembly, and it had some functions of its own, like receiving ambassadors and doing some things like that. So it's, again, an interesting example where it looks like there's a second house, but actually the second house is kind of subordinate and kind of instrumental to the, as it were, we might think the main house. Now, on the other hand, one of the things that's kind of tricky about this, though, is that the Greeks tended, as I argued in my last lecture, they tended to think of their laws as largely inherited. So they didn't really think that there was this danger that the assembly was tomorrow going to change all the laws. That just wasn't something that was going to happen. So the power of the assembly was more about policy decisions rather than about lawmaking. I'm going to try to talk about this a bit more next time and also in my series next year, because it's quite hard for us to get our heads around that. When we think about an assembly or we think of it as a legislature, but that's not actually how the Greek assemblies typically functioned. But having said that, so when we then look for, well, are there models of more like checks and balances, we find that discussed in the post-classical Greek historian Polybius, and he sees it in Sparta and also in Rome, which was already developing at the time that he was writing, or was well known to him. He was kind of living under its sway. So there is an ancient pedigree to the checks and balances ideas, but it's not so much in Athens.
There's one right at the back, and then you.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. My question is this. What would the ancient Greeks make of Karl Marx's demand for equality? To each according to their needs and from each according to their ability. Because doesn't it address that superb critique that France makes in his poem about the equality of law, that it's forbidden for both the rich and the poor to sleep under the bridges and beg on streets. So what would they think of Marx?
Well, it's another thing that Marx said, which is interesting in this context, is that he said democracy is the revealed mystery of all constitutions. So in a sense, he is making that point that it's as an earlier question put it, right? It's a concentration of power of a certain kind of people, and that's what that constitutes. Now, I don't want to so it's interesting. I think the Greeks were very aware of this rich-poor divide. It doesn't follow that they would have, most of them, endorsed the kind of socialist formula that you were talking about. There were some movements for equalization of land, for example, both in Greece and in Rome. So there's some movements that say we should redivide the lands so that more poor people can enjoy land. So there's some idea of that, but yet we also have to say there was also, even the poor were kind of privileged compared to the enslaved, right? So this was not a kind of universal emancipatory vision for the most part that we find Greek thinkers endorsing. I mean, having said that, there are arguments that, other Greek thinkers, Epicurus, for example, is kind of anticipating modern ecology and maybe anticipating Marx in some ways. So of course, one can't generalize. The Greeks thought many things. One can't say they all thought that, but I think not many would have gone fully in that direction. But there's certainly, as you say, elements of that idea that we can recognize.
Question right on the front here.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I really enjoyed that. I just want to ask you, what do you think whether the actualization of equality and lawmaking in, say, state capitalist or socialist countries, would you say that is more viable?
So thank you. So the question about socialism or state capitalism, I think that's a big question, and so I would need to think about more specific cases, which I'm not an expert on. I think that certainly socialist countries, and maybe this picks up the Marx point as well. Central to that ideal has been the kind of distinction between formal and substantive equality that I've been drawing on. So I do think that socialist thinkers have really driven that point home. They've said, there's formal equality in capitalism, but we have the poor sleeping under bridges and so on. And so in that sense, I think that recognition has maybe been more pointed in socialist traditions of thought and practice than always in liberal ones. And so part of what I'm trying to say is liberal Democrats, too, have to recognize that formal equality isn't always enough, and it can be self-undermining. And, that doesn't mean we shouldn't aim for it, but it means we shouldn't assume that it's going to kind of just realize itself easily or always. Yeah.
So we'll take your question, sir, and then I'll take one more from the online audience.
Did the Greeks have a concept of universal law, or was it specific to particular cities and states?
Yeah.
The example I have is that Gladstone specifically forbade officials in Gibraltar to do anything to stop smuggling into Spain because he thought that Spanish duties were immoral.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful example. So the Greeks, this is a really interesting question about the Greeks. There's certainly language of certain kinds of laws that are divine and therefore would apply to all human beings. And so in Sophocles' Antigone, for example, the duty to bury one's kin, that of course then Antigone acts on and that ultimately costs her her life, that's described as a kind of divine law. And we find especially in Stoic philosophy, an appeal to natural law that again is kind of universal and extends as a kind of part of the order of the cosmos. But at the same time, they recognized, distinctive bodies of law. So most of their laws were the laws of Solon, which applied to Athens, or the laws of Lycurgus, which applied to Sparta. So there's a kind of combination. There are some laws that are universal, but certainly in the classical period, that's very few. Mostly these things about kind of our fundamental obligations to kin, to the gods, those sorts of ideas were thought to be more universal. But certainly there would be many laws that they would say, these are laws for Athens, they're not laws, for Sparta. And then there are some things in between, like all of them recognizing Delphi, all of them, sort of honoring the Olympic Games, and so on. So there's a sort of continuum, I think.
Right, I'm going to read out the last question online because I'm sure Melissa will need a drink very shortly. Could you say something about the Egyptian influence on those Greeks who admiring Egypt's long-term stability supported eunomia as opposed to isonomia?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. Actually, Herodotus mentions that Solon, for example, borrowed one of his laws from ancient Egypt. And the Greeks were very aware that the Egyptians, as they thought of it, had a much more ancient civilization than the Greeks did. And we find this very pointedly in Plato, partly because Greek cities seem to be more subject to kind of sort of natural and political earthquakes, as it were. And even though in Egypt, of course, there's the ebb and flow of the Nile, the thought was that the Egyptians had learned to manage that. And so they had achieved a more stable civilization with longer written records. The Greeks were aware that the Egyptians had had writing for longer than they had had. So I hadn't connected it specifically to eunomia, and that's a great thought that I want to explore. But I think certainly the idea that the Egyptians are practitioners of religious and legal ordering that is more ancient than anything that the Greeks thought that they had achieved, and that was a kind of model in many ways for the Greeks. I think that's definitely true.
Well, what a fantastic lecture. Wonderful answering of questions as well after such a long flight. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Professor Melissa Lane.
Thank you. Thank you.